Sometimes the most important decisions in life come disguised as ordinary moments. A woman stands in a doorway with a suitcase, speaking words that will change everything. A man in worn boots and a weathered hat must choose between the life he's always known and the love he never expected to find. In the space between her declaration and his response lies a story of second chances, buried dreams, and the courage it takes to start over when everything feels like it's ending. What happens when the person you've been waiting for your whole life is also the one walking away? The dust cloud appeared on the horizon just after noon, cutting through the heat waves that danced above the desert highway. Jake Martinez wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his gloved hand and squinted at the approaching vehicle. Visitors were rare at the Broken Arrow Ranch, especially ones arriving in what looked like a small, beat-up sedan that had no business navigating the rough dirt road leading to his property. The car lurched and bounced over the ruts, its engine coughing like an old man climbing stairs. Jake set down the fence post he'd been working on and walked toward the main gate, his boots crunching on the sun-baked earth. The vehicle finally came to a shuddering stop about 20 feet away, and, for a moment, nothing happened. The engine ticked as it cooled, and, somewhere in the distance, a hawk circled lazily in the blue sky. Then, the driver's door opened, and out stepped a woman who looked like she'd been driving for days. Her dark hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, strands escaping to frame a face that was both tired and determined. She wore faded jeans and a white cotton shirt that had seen better days, and, when she looked at Jake, her green eyes held a mixture of wariness and hope that he recognized all too well. "You Jake Martinez?" she asked, her voice carrying a slight rasp that suggested she'd been doing a lot of talking or maybe not enough sleeping. "That's me," Jake replied, hooking his thumbs in his belt loops. "You lost?" A smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. "Not anymore, I don't think." She glanced around at the sprawling ranch, taking in the weathered buildings, the horses grazing in the distant pasture, and the mountains that rose like ancient guardians against the sky. "My name's Sarah Chen. I saw your ad online." Jake's eyebrows rose. He'd posted that ad 3 weeks ago on a job board, looking for someone to help manage the ranch's books and handle the growing administrative side of his business. He'd gotten a few responses, but most people took one look at the remote location and decided they weren't interested in trading city conveniences for desert solitude. The bookkeeping position, Sarah continued, pulling a folder from her car. "I know I should have called first, but I was driving through the area and thought I'd take a chance." She was lying, and they both knew it. Nobody just drove through this part of Arizona. You had to make a deliberate choice to end up here, 30 miles from the nearest town and what felt like 1,000 miles from anywhere that mattered. But Jake had learned not to pry too hard into people's reasons for running. Everyone had their own ghosts, and sometimes the desert was the only place quiet enough to hear yourself think. "You have experience with ranch finances?" he asked, accepting the folder she offered. "I have an accounting degree and 5 years of experience managing budgets for a construction company in Phoenix," Sarah said. "I know it's not exactly the same thing, but numbers are numbers, right?" Jake flipped through her resume and references, impressed despite himself. Sarah Chen was clearly overqualified for what he was offering, which only deepened the mystery of why she was standing in his dusty yard instead of working in some air-conditioned office building. "Phoenix," he said, looking up from the papers. "That's a long way from here." "Sometimes a long way is exactly what you need," Sarah replied, and there was something in her voice that made Jake decide not to ask any more questions about her past, at least not yet. He studied her for a moment longer. She stood straight despite the obvious exhaustion, and her handshake had been firm when she'd introduced herself. There was strength in her, the kind that came from surviving something difficult. Jake recognized it because he'd seen it in his own mirror often enough. "The job doesn't pay much," he warned. "Room and board included, but it's not going to make you rich." "I'm not looking to get rich," Sarah said. "I'm looking for honest work and a place to catch my breath." The honesty in her answer decided it for him. Jake had been running the Broken Arrow alone for 3 years, ever since his father died and left him the ranch along with a mountain of debt and a business model that belonged to a different century. He'd been slowly modernizing operations, expanding from traditional cattle ranching to include guided horseback tours for city folks wanting to experience the authentic West. The tourist side of the business was growing, but so was the paperwork, and Jake had reached the point where he spent more time shuffling papers than working with horses. "There's a small apartment above the office," he said, nodding toward a low building near the main house. "It's nothing fancy, but it's clean and private. Kitchen, bathroom, living area. Internet's decent when the weather cooperates." Sarah's relief was visible, though she tried to hide it. "When would you need me to start?" "How about now?" Jake asked. "I can show you around, get you settled, and you can take a look at the books. See what you're getting yourself into." They spent the next hour walking the property as Jake explained the operation. The Broken Arrow covered 800 acres of high desert, with facilities for 30 horses, a main house that had been in his family for 3 generations, and various outbuildings that served different functions. The guest operation was still small but growing, with a bunkhouse that could accommodate up to 12 visitors and a dining hall where Jake's cook, Maria, served meals that had people leaving 5-star reviews online. Sarah asked smart questions about cash flow, seasonal variations in business, and the costs associated with maintaining horses and facilities. She took notes in a small notebook, and Jake found himself appreciating her thoroughness. Most of the people who'd responded to his ad had seemed more interested in the romantic idea of ranch life than the practical realities of making it work as a business. "The previous owner," Sarah said as they walked past a partially renovated barn. "Your father, you said?" "Yeah. Dad bought this place in 1987 with money he made in the oil business. It was supposed to be his retirement project, but he kept working until the day he died." Jake kicked at a loose stone. He was old school. Kept all the books by hand, didn't trust computers, ran everything based on gut instinct and handshake deals. "And now you're trying to modernize." Trying being the key word. Jake stopped and looked out over the pasture where a dozen horses grazed peacefully. Dad's way worked for him, but times change. People expect websites, online booking, credit card processing. The traditional ranch business is tough these days. The guest operation helps, but it's a different kind of challenge. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "How long have you been doing the guest services?" "About 2 years seriously. Started small, word of mouth mostly. But we're booked solid through the fall now, and I've got inquiries coming in from travel agencies." Jake smiled slightly. "Turns out people will pay good money to pretend they're cowboys for a week." They ended the tour at the office, a single-story building that had once been a barn but had been converted into administrative space. The apartment upstairs was accessed by an external staircase, and, while it was indeed small, it was clean and comfortable. Sarah stood at the window looking out over the desert, and Jake saw something in her posture relax for the first time since she'd arrived. "It's peaceful," she said. "It can be. It can also be isolating, especially if you're used to city life." Sarah turned from the window. "I think I've had enough of city life for a while." Jake wanted to ask what had happened to bring her here, what she was running from or toward, but he held back. People shared their stories when they were ready, and pushing too hard too fast was a good way to send them back down that dusty road. "Let me show you the books," he said instead, leading her to the office downstairs. The next 2 hours were both embarrassing and enlightening. Jake had to admit that his record-keeping was haphazard at best, a mixture of computer files, handwritten ledgers, receipts stuffed in boxes, and his own admittedly fallible memory. Sarah went through it all with the patience of an archaeologist, asking questions and making notes, gradually building a picture of the ranch's financial situation. "It's not as bad as it could be," she said finally, looking up from a stack of invoices. "You're actually making money, which is more than a lot of small businesses can say. But you're definitely leaving money on the table because your systems are so scattered." "How much money?" Jake asked. Sarah did some quick calculations on a piece of paper. "Hard to say without digging deeper, but I guess you could increase your profit margin by 15 to 20% just by better tracking of expenses and more strategic pricing." Jake whistled softly. 20% would make a real difference, enough to finally tackle some of the bigger improvements the ranch needed. "There's something else," Sarah continued. "I noticed you're not taking advantage of several tax deductions you're probably eligible for." When's the last time you talked to an accountant? Never, really. Dad always did his own taxes, and I just kept using the same guy in town. He's nice enough, but I don't think he really understands the ranch business. Sarah nodded. I have some contacts from my previous job. People who specialize in agricultural and hospitality businesses. With your permission, I could reach out, see what options we have. The word we hung in the air between them, and Jake realized that somewhere during the afternoon, he'd stopped thinking of Sarah as a potential employee and started thinking of her as a potential partner. Not in a romantic sense, at least not yet, but in the way that really good business relationships developed. She understood what he was trying to do, and, more importantly, she could help him do it better. Sounds good, he said. When can you start? I already have, Sarah replied with the first genuine smile he'd seen from her all day. That evening, Jake sat on the porch of the main house, a beer in his hand and his dog, Rex, sprawled at his feet. The apartment above the office glowed with warm light, and he could see Sarah's silhouette moving around as she unpacked her things. He wondered again what had brought her here, what story lay behind the careful way she answered questions about her past. Maria emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She was 63 years old and had been working at the ranch since before Jake's father died. She'd seen plenty of changes over the years and had strong opinions about most of them. She seems nice, Maria said, settling into the rocking chair beside Jake's. Yeah, she does. Pretty, too. Jake shot Maria a warning look. She's here to do a job, Maria. That's all. Maria's laugh was knowing. Of course, Mijo. That's all. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the desert light fade to purple and, then, to black. The stars came out in numbers that still amazed people from the city, a vast canopy that seemed close enough to touch. You know what I think? Maria said eventually. I'm sure you're going to tell me. I think people don't end up in places like this by accident. That girl, she's running from something, but maybe she's also running toward something. Maybe what she's running toward is here. Jake considered this. And what if what she's running from catches up with her? Then, you help her deal with it, Maria said simply. That's what good people do. Later that night, Jake lay in bed listening to the sounds of the desert. Somewhere in the distance, coyotes called to each other, their voices carrying across the empty space. It was a sound that had comforted him since childhood, a reminder that even in the vastness of the desert, nothing was ever really alone. He thought about Sarah Chen and wondered what dreams and nightmares had driven her to his door. Tomorrow they would start working together, building something better from the scattered pieces of his father's legacy. It felt like a beginning, though Jake couldn't quite put his finger on what was beginning. In the apartment above the office, Sarah stood at her window, looking out at the same stars Jake could see from his bedroom. She'd come here hoping for sanctuary, for time to heal and plan her next move. What she hadn't expected was to feel, for the first time in months, like she might be exactly where she was supposed to be. The desert kept its secrets, and so did the people who found their way to places like the Broken Arrow Ranch. But, sometimes, in the quiet spaces between one day and the next, those secrets began to matter less than the promise of what tomorrow might bring. 3 weeks into her stay at the Broken Arrow Ranch, Sarah Chen had transformed the chaos of Jake's financial records into something resembling order. The office that had once been a graveyard of scattered receipts and half-finished spreadsheets now hummed with efficiency. She'd installed new software, created systematic filing systems, and somehow managed to uncover nearly $8,000 in overlooked tax deductions from the previous year. But it wasn't just the numbers that had changed. The whole rhythm of the ranch seemed different now, more purposeful. Sarah had a way of anticipating problems before they became crises, of seeing patterns that Jake had missed. When she noticed that feed costs were spiking every third month, she traced it back to a supplier who was overcharging during busy periods. When she realized that guest bookings were clustering in ways that left some weeks overcrowded and others nearly empty, she worked with Jake to implement a pricing strategy that smoothed out demand. Jake found himself looking forward to their morning meetings, when Sarah would arrive at the office with coffee and a list of things they needed to discuss. She had a mind like a steel trap for details, but she also understood the bigger picture in ways that impressed him. She wasn't just managing the ranch's money, she was helping him build a sustainable future. "We need to talk about expansion," Sarah said one morning in late September, spreading a series of charts across Jake's desk. The coffee was still steaming in their mugs, and the morning air carried the promise of another hot day. Jake studied the projections Sarah had prepared. "These numbers are real?" "As real as numbers can be. Your guest operation is booked solid through next spring, and you're turning away about 30% of inquiries because you don't have capacity." Sarah pointed to a graph showing reservation requests versus available slots. "At current rates, you're leaving roughly $50,000 on the table every season." The amount was staggering. Jake had always thought of the guest ranch as a nice supplement to the traditional cattle operation, not as the potential primary revenue source. But Sarah's analysis showed clearly that hospitality was where the real money lay. "What kind of expansion are you thinking?" he asked. Sarah pulled out architectural sketches she'd been working on during her free time. "Nothing too ambitious initially. Another bunkhouse, maybe 12 more beds. Update the dining hall to handle larger groups. The real opportunity is in corporate retreats and special events. City companies will pay premium rates to bring their teams out here for leadership training, team building, that sort of thing." Jake was quiet for a long moment, studying the plans. The vision Sarah was describing would essentially double the size of his operation. It would require a significant investment, probably more debt than he was comfortable taking on. But he couldn't argue with her numbers, and the detailed way she'd thought through the logistics impressed him. "How long have you been working on this?" he asked. Sarah flushed slightly. "I know it's probably overstepping. You hired me to manage the books, not redesign your business. It's just that I see so much potential here, and it seems like a shame not to explore it." "It's not overstepping," Jake said quickly. "It's exactly the kind of thinking we need. I just wonder where you learned to think this strategically about hospitality business." For a moment, Sarah's carefully maintained composure flickered. Jake caught a glimpse of something painful in her expression, quickly hidden. "I used to work for a development company in Phoenix," she said carefully. "We specialized in resort and entertainment properties. I learned a lot about what makes hospitality businesses succeed or fail." It was the most she'd revealed about her previous life since arriving at the ranch. Jake sensed there was more to the story, but he also recognized the walls people built around difficult memories. He'd had enough therapy after his father's death to understand that healing happened at its own pace. "Well, whatever you learned, I'm grateful for it," he said. "Let me think about the expansion idea. It's a big step." Sarah nodded, gathering up her papers. "Of course. And, Jake? Thank you for trusting me enough to let me put together these proposals. I know you took a risk hiring someone who just showed up at your gate." After Sarah left for the day, Jake found himself walking the property with new eyes, imagining the changes she'd outlined. He could see where the new bunkhouse would go, how the expanded dining hall would look, where they might put the conference facility she'd suggested for corporate groups. It was an exciting vision, but it was also intimidating. That evening, as was becoming routine, he found himself on the porch with Maria and Rex, watching the sun set over the desert. Maria had been observing the growing partnership between Jake and Sarah with the keen interest of someone who'd seen decades of ranch life unfold. "She's good for this place," Maria said without preamble. "The bookkeeping situation is definitely better," Jake agreed. Maria gave him a look that suggested he was being deliberately obtuse. "That's not what I mean, and you know it." Jake did know it, but he wasn't ready to examine the other ways Sarah's presence had changed things. The way she laughed at his stories during their morning meetings. The way she'd started joining him for walks around the property in the evenings, their conversations ranging from ranch business to books to their shared love of old Western movies. The way he'd begun to think of the ranch not as his solitary refuge but as a place that was somehow more complete with her in it. "She's got secrets, Maria," Jake said. "Something drove her here, and I don't think it was just a desire for career change." "Everyone's got secrets, Mijo. The question is whether they're the kind of secrets that hurt people or the kind that just hurt the person carrying them." Before Jake could respond, his phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Sarah, emergency in the office. Can you come over to Jake was on his feet immediately, jogging across the yard to the office building. He found Sarah upstairs in her apartment, sitting at her small kitchen table with her laptop open and a stricken expression on her face. What's wrong? He asked. Sarah turned the laptop toward him. On the screen was a news article from a Phoenix business journal. The headline read, Development Executive Charged in Resort Project Fraud Scheme. Jake read the article quickly, his understanding growing with each paragraph. 3 executives from Pinnacle Development Group had been arrested on charges of embezzling funds from a major resort project. The scheme had apparently been operating for 2 years, involving falsified invoices, kickbacks from contractors, and misappropriated construction funds. The resort project had been shut down, leaving investors facing losses in the millions. I worked for Pinnacle, Sarah said quietly. For 5 years. I managed the budgets for their biggest projects, including the one mentioned in the article. Jake sat down across from her. Are you implicated? Not directly. The FBI cleared me early in their investigation. I was the one who first noticed the discrepancies and reported them to management. Sarah's laugh was bitter. Turns out management was in on it. The pieces started falling into place for Jake. That's why you left Phoenix. After I reported what I'd found, things got complicated fast. The executives I'd reported started suggesting that I might have been involved in the irregularities. Nothing official, nothing they could prove, but enough whispers to make my life difficult. I was getting followed, getting threatening phone calls. My apartment was broken into twice, though nothing was ever stolen. Sarah closed the laptop and leaned back in her chair. The FBI believed me, but some of the other employees didn't. People I'd worked with for years started treating me like I was either a traitor or a criminal. The stress was eating me alive. So you ran? I ran, Sarah confirmed. Packed what I could fit in my car and just started driving. I told myself I'd figure out where to go when I got there, and somehow I ended up here. Jake was quiet for a moment, processing what Sarah had told him. It explained the wariness he'd sensed in her when she first arrived, the way she sometimes seemed to be listening for something that never came. It also explained her overqualification for the job and her desperate relief when he'd offered her the position. Why are you telling me this now? He asked. Sarah gestured at the laptop. Because one of them was sentenced today. Richard Hawthorne, the CEO. The news coverage is bringing everything back up, and I'm worried that someone might connect me to the ranch. Would that be dangerous? I don't know. Probably not. The people who were making my life difficult are either in jail now or too busy with their own legal problems to worry about me. But I thought you deserved to know what you might be getting into by keeping me around. Jake studied Sarah's face, seeing the fear and uncertainty she was trying to hide. She was preparing for him to ask her to leave, he realized. She'd told him her story because she felt she owed him the truth, even if it cost her the sanctuary she'd found here. Are you planning to testify at any trials? He asked. The FBI hasn't contacted me about that yet, but it's possible. Will you have to go back to Phoenix? If they subpoena me, yes. Jake nodded thoughtfully. Well, then, we should probably get that expansion project moving faster than I originally planned. I'm going to need someone I can trust to manage things if I have to cover for you while you're dealing with legal stuff. Sarah stared at him. You're not asking me to leave? Why would I ask you to leave? You reported financial crimes. You tried to do the right thing, and some powerful people made your life hell for it. That doesn't make you a liability, it makes you exactly the kind of person I want managing my finances. The relief that flooded Sarah's face was almost painful to watch. Jake realized that she'd been carrying this fear since the day she arrived, wondering when her past would catch up and destroy the new life she was trying to build. I should have told you sooner, she said. You told me when you were ready. That's what matters. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the tension that had been building since Sarah opened the laptop gradually dissipating. Outside, the desert night was settling in, bringing its familiar chorus of coyotes and nightbirds. "Jake," Sarah said finally, "can I ask you something?" "Shoot." "What made you decide to trust me?" "That first day, when I showed up out of nowhere with a story that didn't quite add up." "Most people would have sent me packing." Jake considered the question. "I guess I recognized something in you that I'd felt in myself. When my dad died, I was lost for a while. I had a ranch I didn't know how to run and debts I couldn't pay. I was making mistakes left and right, alienating customers, neglecting the animals. If Maria hadn't basically forced me to get some help, I probably would have lost everything." "What kind of help?" "Therapy, mostly. And a support group for people dealing with grief and major life changes. It took me a while to admit I needed it, but it probably saved my life." Sarah nodded slowly. "I've been thinking about therapy. Just haven't figured out how to find someone out here. There's a woman in Flagstaff who does video sessions. Dr. Rodriguez. She helped me a lot, and I think she might be good for you too, if you're interested. I'd like that contact information, if you don't mind sharing it." Jake pulled out his phone and sent Sarah the therapist's details. As he did, he realized that something fundamental had shifted between them. The careful professional distance they'd maintained was dissolving, replaced by something deeper and more personal. "Sarah," he said, "I want you to know that whatever happens with the legal situation, you have a place here as long as you want it. Not just because you're good at your job, though you are. Because you're part of what's making this place work now." The next morning, Sarah woke before dawn and walked out to watch the sunrise from the small deck outside her apartment. The desert landscape spread out before her, vast and beautiful in the early light. For the first time since leaving Phoenix, she felt like she could breathe fully. She thought about the conversation with Jake the night before, about his reaction to her story and his offer of continued support. She'd spent so many months feeling like she was balancing on the edge of a cliff that she'd forgotten what solid ground felt like. A movement caught her eye, and she looked down to see Jake emerging from the main house with Rex at his side. He was heading toward the horse barn to begin the morning feeding routine. Without quite deciding to do it, Sarah found herself walking down the stairs and across the yard. "Mind if I help?" she called out. Jake turned, surprised but pleased. "You sure? It's pretty messy work. I think I can handle it." For the next hour, they worked together in comfortable rhythm, feeding horses and checking water levels. Sarah had grown up around animals but had forgotten how peaceful it could be to focus on simple, necessary tasks. The horses whickered softly as they ate, and the morning air was cool and clean. "I've been thinking about your expansion plans," Jake said as they finished with the last paddock. "And I want to move forward. Not all at once, maybe, but let's start with the new bunkhouse and see how it goes." Sarah smiled, feeling a flutter of excitement. "Really? Really? I talked to the bank yesterday afternoon, after our meeting. I think we can make the numbers work, especially with your projections showing the potential return on investment." They walked back toward the office building together, the sun now fully up and promising another warm day. Sarah felt a sense of possibility that had been missing from her life for months. She had work that mattered, a place that felt like home, and maybe something else that she wasn't quite ready to name yet. "Jake," she said as they reached the porch of the main house, where Maria was already starting breakfast preparations. "Yeah? Thank you. For everything." Jake smiled, and Sarah caught something in his expression that made her heart skip a beat. "Thank you for taking a chance on a dusty ranch in the middle of nowhere." "It doesn't feel like the middle of nowhere anymore," Sarah replied, and realized as she said it that it was absolutely true. 6 months later, the Broken Arrow Ranch had transformed into something Jake barely recognized. The new bunkhouse stood completed, its timber frame weathered just enough to look like it belonged on the landscape. Corporate groups now booked months in advance for leadership retreats, and the ranch's reputation had spread far enough that travel magazines were starting to take notice. Sarah's vision was becoming reality, one carefully managed detail at a time. But success brought its own complications. On a crisp February morning, Jake found Sarah in the office earlier than usual, her laptop open to an email that had arrived overnight. The expression on her face told him it wasn't good news. "The federal prosecutor wants me to testify," she said without preamble. 3 weeks from now. The defense attorneys for 2 of the executives are claiming I was involved in the fraud and that my testimony is unreliable because I benefited from the scheme. Jake poured himself coffee and sat down across from her desk. Over the months, he'd learned to read Sarah's moods in the subtle changes of her posture, the way she held her shoulders when she was stressed. This morning, she looked like she was preparing for battle. "What does your lawyer say?" "That it's a standard defense tactic. They're trying to discredit me before I even take the stand. The prosecutor is confident we can counter their claims, but it means I'll probably be in Phoenix for at least 2 weeks. Maybe longer if there are delays." The timing couldn't be worse. March was when the ranch's busy season began, with back-to-back corporate bookings and the first tourist groups of the year. Sarah had been training Maria's daughter, Elena, to help with administrative tasks, but she wasn't ready to handle the complex logistics alone. "We'll manage," Jake said. "Elena's good with the booking system, and I can cover the financial stuff while you're gone." Sarah looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and something else he couldn't quite identify. "Jake, there's something else. Something I haven't told you." She pulled out a second email, this one from a law firm in Denver. Jake read it quickly, his frown deepening with each paragraph. A major hotel chain was offering Sarah a position as their regional finance director for mountain and desert properties. The salary was nearly triple what the ranch could pay her, plus benefits, stock options, and a relocation package to Colorado. "They've been pursuing me for months," Sarah explained. "Ever since the Phoenix situation made the news, apparently. The managing partner at this firm represents several hospitality companies, and he thinks my experience with the fraud case makes me valuable. Someone who can spot financial irregularities before they become major problems." Jake set the email down carefully, trying to process what he was reading. The offer was generous enough that any sane person would take it. Sarah could start over in Denver with a clean slate, build a new career far from the shadows of the Phoenix scandal. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I'm thinking that I need to be practical. The ranch is doing well, but we both know I'm overqualified for what you can afford to pay me long term. This offer would set me up financially for years." The rational part of Jake's mind agreed with her. Sarah had skills and experience that could take her much further than a small ranch in Arizona. But the rational part of his mind wasn't the part that had been looking forward to their morning coffee meetings, or the part that had started imagining a future where she was a permanent fixture in his life. When do they need an answer? 2 weeks. The timeline meant Sarah would have to decide while she was in Phoenix, dealing with the stress of testimony and court proceedings. Jake wondered if that was intentional, if the law firm was betting that the pressure of the trial would make their offer more attractive. "I don't want to leave," Sarah said quietly. "This place has become home in ways I didn't expect. The work we're doing here matters. But I also can't ignore the practical realities." Over the following days, Jake found himself watching Sarah with new awareness, noticing things he'd been taking for granted. The way she talked to the horses when she thought no one was listening. How she'd started wearing boots instead of sneakers, her movements becoming more confident around the ranch operations. The garden she'd planted behind her apartment, where herbs and vegetables were already beginning to sprout in the desert soil. She belonged here, in ways that went beyond job descriptions or practical arrangements. But Jake also understood the pull of security, especially for someone who'd lost everything once before. The night before Sarah was scheduled to leave for Phoenix, Jake found her sitting on the porch of the main house, looking out over the desert. The moon was full, casting everything in silver light that made the landscape look like something from a dream. "Nervous about tomorrow?" he asked, settling into the chair beside her. "Terrified," Sarah admitted. "Not just about the testimony, though that's scary enough. About making the right choice about everything else." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the desert. Finally, Jake spoke the words he'd been rehearsing for days. "Sarah, I need you to know something before you go. What's happened here, between us, it's not just about business for me anymore. Sarah turned to look at him, her green eyes reflecting the moonlight. I know the ranch can't compete with what they're offering you in Denver, Jake continued. The money, the career opportunities, the city life. But, if you're willing to take a chance on something different, I'd like to talk about making you a partner instead of an employee. A partner? Full partnership. Equal ownership, equal decision-making, equal profits. We build this place together, not as boss and employee but as equals. Jake's voice was steady, but Sarah could hear the emotion underneath. I've got some money saved, and, with the success we've had this year, I think we could get financing to buy out half my stake and transfer it to you. The offer was more generous than anything Sarah had dared to hope for. It would mean real ownership, real control over her future. But, it would also mean committing to this place, to this life, in ways that felt both thrilling and terrifying. Jake, she said softly, are you offering me a business partnership or something more? It was the question Jake had been avoiding, even in his own thoughts. But, sitting there in the moonlight, with Sarah looking at him with such honesty and openness, he found he couldn't hide behind professional language anymore. Both, if you're interested in both. I love working with you, Sarah. I love the vision we've built together and the way you've made this place better. But, I also love coming home to you every day, even when we're just talking about feed costs and reservation schedules. I love the way you laugh at my terrible jokes and the way you've become part of this place. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, and Jake felt his heart hammering in his chest. He'd laid everything on the table, all his hopes and fears and dreams for what they might build together. I love you too, she said finally. I think I have for months, but I was so scared of jinxing what we had. And I'm still scared, Jake. What if the Denver job is the smart choice? What if I'm letting my feelings cloud my judgment? Then, we figure it out as we go, Jake said. That's what partnerships are for. Sarah left for Phoenix the next morning, and Jake threw himself into ranch work to distract himself from the waiting. The days crawled by, punctuated only by brief text messages from Sarah updating him on the court proceedings. The trial was going well, she reported. The defense attorney's attempts to implicate her had backfired, making them look desperate and unethical. The prosecution expected to rest their case by the end of the week. On Thursday evening, Jake's phone rang. Sarah's voice sounded exhausted but relieved. It's over, she said. The defense decided not to call me as a witness after all. All three defendants pled guilty to reduced charges this afternoon. That's great news. When are you coming home? There was a pause that made Jake's stomach tighten. Jake, I need to tell you something. The law firm here, they've been incredibly supportive during the trial. They assigned one of their senior partners to help me navigate the media attention, made sure I had everything I needed. And, yesterday, they sweetened their offer. Jake closed his eyes, knowing what was coming. How much sweeter? They're offering to make me a full partner in their firm within 2 years. Not just an employee, but an actual equity partner. The kind of opportunity that comes along maybe once in a lifetime. The irony wasn't lost on Jake. He'd offered Sarah partnership in a small desert ranch, and now she was being offered partnership in a major law firm with national reach. What are you going to tell them? I haven't decided yet. That's why I'm calling. I want to see you before I make any final decisions. Can you meet me somewhere? Maybe halfway between Phoenix and the ranch? They arranged to meet the next evening at a small restaurant in Sedona, about 2 hours from the ranch. Jake spent the drive trying to prepare himself for either outcome. If Sarah chose Denver, he would wish her well and mean it. If she chose the ranch, he would do everything in his power to make sure she never regretted it. The restaurant sat on a cliff overlooking red rock formations that glowed like fire in the setting sun. Jake arrived first and waited at a corner table, watching the door until Sarah walked in. She looked professional and polished in a way that reminded him of the day she'd first arrived at the ranch, and, for a moment he wondered if she'd already made her decision. You look good, he said as she sat down. Phoenix will do that to you. Dry cleaning and air conditioning work miracles. They ordered dinner and made small talk about the trial and the ranch, both of them dancing around the real reason they were there. Finally, as the desert darkened and lights began to twinkle in the valley below, Sarah set down her wineglass and looked directly at Jake. "I turned them down," she said. "This afternoon. I told them thank you, but I have other commitments." Jake felt his heart restart after what seemed like several missed beats. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure. During the trial, when things got stressful, I kept thinking about the ranch. Not about the work, though I love the work, but about the place itself. About Maria's cooking and the sound of the horses in the morning and the way the stars look from my apartment window." Sarah smiled. "I kept thinking about you, and about the life we could build together. Even though it means giving up a lot of money and prestige? Even though some things are worth more than money, and I finally figured out what those things are for me." Jake reached across the table and took her hand. "So what happens now?" "Now we go home and figure out how to be partners in every sense of the word. I warn you, though, I have some ideas about expanding the conference facilities that might surprise you." They drove back to the ranch separately, Jake following Sarah's taillights through the desert darkness. When they pulled into the ranch yard, Maria was waiting on the porch with Rex, both of them greeting Sarah like she'd been gone for months instead of weeks. "Welcome home, Mija," Maria said, enveloping Sarah in a fierce hug. "It's good to be home," Sarah replied, and Jake could hear in her voice that she truly meant it. Later that night, Jake and Sarah sat on the steps of her apartment, sharing a bottle of wine and planning their future. The partnership papers could be drawn up within a few weeks. The expansion projects would continue. They would modernize the guest facilities and maybe add a spa component that Sarah thought would appeal to their target market. "There's one more thing," Sarah said as they prepared to call it a night. "What's that?" "This is my last night here," she said, gesturing toward the apartment. "I mean, the last night I'll be living here alone." Jake looked at her, understanding dawning. "Are you asking what I think you're asking?" "I'm asking if you'd like to wake up together tomorrow. And the day after that. And maybe see where this thing between us leads when we're not worried about professional boundaries anymore." Jake's answer was a kiss that tasted like wine and promise and the beginning of something neither of them had dared to dream of when Sarah first arrived with her battered car and her careful walls. The next morning, Maria found them both in the kitchen of the main house, making coffee and breakfast with the easy familiarity of people who belonged together. She smiled to herself as she watched them plan their day, their movements synchronized in ways that spoke of a deeper connection than either business partnership or romance could explain alone. "Some people," Maria murmured to Rex, who was hoping for bacon scraps, "are just meant to find each other. Even if they have to drive through the desert to do it." Outside, the sun rose over the Broken Arrow Ranch, illuminating a landscape that looked exactly the same as it had a year ago but felt entirely transformed. In the distance, horses grazed peacefully in pastures that would soon welcome new guests seeking their own taste of the authentic West. The desert kept its secrets and its promises, offering sanctuary to those brave enough to trust in second chances and new beginnings. Sarah Chen had arrived at the ranch running from a life that had fallen apart. She was staying to build a life that felt like everything she'd never known she wanted. Some choices, she was learning, were easy once you figured out what really mattered. And, sometimes, the person you'd been waiting for your whole life turned out to be waiting in a place you never expected to find.